This is the country where almost 60% of the population lives in areas that could flood at any moment during high tides. In 1953, the sea broke through the Netherlands' defenses, killing over 1,800 people in a single night. But instead of just building higher walls, the Dutch took a radical decision. They started building suburbs and housing on the water. Even though one-third of the country's land is below sea level, why it is pushing itself into water? Despite being a beautiful country located in northwestern Europe, the Netherlands borders Germany to the east and Belgium to the south. But the north and the west are surrounded by the North Sea, which keeps approximately one-third of the landscape anywhere from 26 to 33% below sea level, with some areas sitting as deep as 7 meters below the surface. It is renowned for its flat landscape, canals, and urban areas like the capital city of Amsterdam. But behind these beautifully designed cities and landscape conceals a complex network of dikes and locks, strongly holding a highly dense population of the coastal nation. The majority of the population living in these areas would simply not be above water without this great engineered water system which has been forged over centuries. By looking at this data from the last 2 centuries, we can understand that the Dutch went through numerous water-related disasters. Several resulted in catastrophic loss of life, while others caused severe economic devastation. But how come the Netherlands became so vulnerable to floods in the first place? To understand this, we need to go back 1,000 years, when parts of the Netherlands were already at or below sea level, and much of the land was still wetlands. It was once protected by dunes and natural barriers, but was later extensively drained by humans to create polders. As the Dutch population grew over the centuries, they transformed these wetlands into productive farmland and thriving urban spaces. But another side of the story is this: removing wetlands made flooding more dangerous and left the land increasingly vulnerable to sinking. Large-scale wetland destruction began around 1000 AD as settlers started draining peat bogs and marshes and digging canals from farming. The consequences were slow but severe. The land itself began to sink, growing even more vulnerable to floods, while drained peat shrank and collapsed beneath the surface. People began fighting floods around 1200 AD by building dikes and artificial dwelling moats called tops. Among the oldest democratic institutions ever created were the Dutch water boards. The Hoogheemraadschap van Rhijnland, for instance, dates back to 1255, predating many modern states by centuries. The period between 1600 and 1800 was an era of extraordinary engineering ambition. Across the Netherlands, windmills were harnessed to pump water out of lakes, reclaiming vast stretches of lands from water. Among the first and finest results of this effort was the Beemster polder, born in 1612, when an entire lake was drained through windmill power, transforming open water into fertile land. When steam engines replaced windmills between 1800 and the 1930s, the Dutch grip on water grew more aggressive and faster. During this period, a peat bog of about 31 square kilometers in the northern branch of the Rhine River was drained, creating what is now known as the Haarlemmermeer. Climate change, however, has shifted the stakes. Sea levels along the Dutch coast have been rising at nearly 3 mm per year in recent decades, among the fastest rates ever recorded. But this rise didn't begin recently. Measurements show it started in the late 19th century, gradually accelerating over time from slow increases in the 1800s to the much faster rise we see today. Since then, the sea along the Dutch coast has risen by 25 centimeters. Yet more concerning than the rise itself is its pace, and sea level rise is far from the only threat the Dutch face. Extreme rainfall, river flooding, freshwater shortages, droughts, and sinking land together represents the full scale of climate challenges, forcing the Netherlands to reimagine how it sustains itself on a rapidly changing landscape. But even after enduring several massive floods, the way Dutch learned to live with water is truly fascinating. No nation on earth has fought harder or understood water more deeply than the Dutch. But what made them masters of water management was not luck. For centuries, the Netherlands committed to rigidly separating water and land, using dikes, canals, and drainage systems. While this protected land from flooding, it was also severely severed rivers and natural habitats. Even before the catastrophic flood of 1953, Dutch researchers had already begun planning to close off river mouth with dams, recognizing that the sea defenses in the southwestern delta would not withstand a severe storm surge. Construction, however, was significantly delayed, interrupted by the Second World War, and hampered by the sheer scale of the project, and was not completed until 1950. Although the Netherlands had dams and embankment in place, the dikes stood too low, poorly maintained, and unprepared for extreme storms. As a consequence, when the sea broke through, it flooded over 330,000 acres of land, destroying more than 47,000 buildings. Nearly 5% of the entire country lay underwater. There was no warning. As water rose through the night, thousands were trapped in their homes, helpless and completely unprepared. Over 70,000 were forced to abandon their homes. Tens of thousands of livestock drowned, and thousands never made it out at all. But after the disaster, the Dutch made a radical choice. Rather than building higher walls, they chose to live with water. In April 1976, a massive construction project began in response to the devastation of the North Sea flood, but it became one of the most challenging dams to build without destroying the marine ecosystem. Originally, the Dutch planned to seal off the Oosterschelde estuary with a solid dam, maximizing flood protection, but at the cost of destroying saltwater ecosystem and local livelihoods. In some cases, it would have wiped out fisheries, turning the area into a lifeless freshwater lake. But flood safety alone wasn't enough. Instead of a solid dam, the Dutch engineered a massive smart barrier in the open sea, one of the most expensive and ambitious parts of the Delta Works. They placed massive concrete pillars armed with movable steel gates, creating a partially open storm surge barrier. Built to tame the sea, the barrier stands on 65 massive pillars fitted with 62 steel gates, each as wide as a city street. These colossal structures were assembled on dry land, then carefully transported and lowered into place by a fleet of specialized ships. Towering up to 40 meters high and weighing 18,000 tons each, the barrier isn't just built to last, it's designed to protect the Netherlands for over 200 years. It would close only during storms. The project took more than a decade to complete and was later celebrated by civil engineers as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. In the 1990s, the Netherlands was struck by 2 devastating floods. In 1993 and 1995, caused by extremely high water levels in Rhine and Meuse rivers. It was a wake-up call that jolted the Netherlands into a policy shift with respect to dealing with river floods. As the sea levels continued to rise by the 21st century, the Dutch engineers had no choice but to pursue completely fresh ideas for water management, because sea levels could rise up to 1 to 2 meters, putting massive pressure on dikes and increasing flood risk significantly. Even though they had strong defenses, climate change was something that could completely turn things worse, and constant improvement remained the only safest option. In 2006, the Dutch cabinet unveiled a €2.2 billion plan to enhance existing structures in floodplain areas. The project covered mainly 4 rivers in the Netherlands. During high waters, these areas were surrendered to flooding, giving the river more space and reducing pressures on the dikes. The primary goal was to ensure the Rhine and its branches could handle 16,000 cubic meters of water every second. That's a massive amount of water flow, enough to fill multiple Olympic swimming pools in the blink of an eye. By implementing over 30 different projects, including lowering floodplains, creating bypasses, and increasing dikes further inland, the country significantly lowered water levels during peak surges. On the coast of the North Sea in the Netherlands and Belgium, there is a river delta formed by the confluence of the Rhine, Meuse, and Scheldt rivers. The entire system is located in the low-lying western Netherlands, which exists to protect Rotterdam and the surrounding areas. By far, Rotterdam is the most important city, as it is one of the largest harbors in the world. Therefore, it is important that the city has an open connection to the ocean. But this open connection creates a huge problem, since the sea can enter the city. As the Rhine-Meuse Seal Delta spreads across the Netherlands, Rotterdam lies directly within it. According to some estimates, this delta covers 25,347 square kilometers, making it one of the largest in Europe. However, many of these islands lie below sea level, making the entire area vulnerable to climate change and rising sea levels. For centuries, people here fought a quiet war against the sea. Starting in the 10th century, farmers built small dikes to protect farmland from flooding. By the 14th century, they had expanded these dikes and canals just before everything was shattered by one of the deadliest disasters in the region's history. The Ors flood, known as St. Elizabeth flood, swallowed thousands of lives and reshaped the delta overnight. The same delta that witnessed the St. Elizabeth disasters would later become ground zero for the 1953 flood and the delta oaks that followed. The Dutch government immediately began building emergency barriers in South Holland as part of the delta oaks. One of the most significant projects is the Magellan Barrier, which protects Rotterdam without blocking the vital shipping route to the port of Rotterdam. This barrier contains 210-meter-long gates, each supported by two 237-meter-long steel trusses. It is usually open but can be closed during extreme storm conditions. The system uses a centralized computer program called BOSS, which predicts water levels and automatically closes the barrier when flooding is expected. However, if it fails, water levels could rise dangerously high. The defenses are built so robustly that flooding is expected to occur only once every several thousand years on average. Instead of throwing up a concrete wall, they built wetlands, and before long, birds and plants started coming back. Many project sites, such as Nordward Folder and the Nijmegen Bypass, were revamped as parks, hiking areas, and rowing courses. In Nijmegen, they carved out a new island in the Wald River, and what was once a flood-prone headache transformed into desirable real estate and a lively public space. However, some areas had to be intentionally lowered or opened to flooding, and convincing people to give up their land and relocate entire communities was not easy. As the Netherlands is a small and densely populated country where land is extremely valuable, giving up farmland or urban spaces to flooding is a significant sacrifice. Even though communities were eventually convinced, the real challenge was working with constantly flowing rivers. With repeated floods and billions of dollars already lost, completing the project on time was the only way to prevent further damage. By relocating dikes farther from the river shore, they created more space within the floodplain for the river during annual floods. But more importantly, it was essential to lower the floodplain, as years of sediment built up from regular flooding had reduced the space available for water, increasing the risk of dangerous floods. In existing structures, groins within the riverbed were lowered to allow faster drainage during rising water levels. In the Dutch villages of Basin and Wapenveld, a green channel was constructed to serve as a flood bypass, while side channels were excavated to reinforce the buffer between the river, infrastructure, and residents. This increased the system's capacity to divert flood water and reduce the risk of dike breaches. Along the river, obstacles such as the hydraulic bridge at Oosterbeek were also removed to improve water flow. By the time the project was completed in 2015, the total cost had reached 2.3 billion euros, with collaboration between local residents and multiple levels of government. However, even if massive infrastructure is built in a specific location, rivers naturally change course over time, forming new branches and abandoning old ones. For example, in the last 5,000 years, around 40 river channel shifts have occurred in the Netherlands. In Roman times, Europeans built the first embankments to protect urban areas, a practice that became more common in medieval times. In the Netherlands, embankments of river branches began well before 1400 AD. Although the project is built in the Netherlands, it changes how the river flows and carries sediment, and over time, these changes can affect river conditions upstream in countries like Germany, France, Belgium, and even Switzerland. Engineers decided to no longer instinctively raise the embankments, but to first explore whether they could lower flood levels by making more room for the river. In 2007, former Minister Cees Veerman convened a Delta Commission to issue an urgent advisory report on water management for the Netherlands, because without understanding of the possible rise in sea level, it would be difficult to address water scarcity effectively. In the most extreme scenarios, it remains deeply uncertain whether the Netherlands could stay inhabitable at all. By the time the Delta Commission finished their research, it was obvious that Dutch sea levels would rise by 65 to 130 cm by the 21st century. So they advised to the government to build stronger dikes, wider coast, better water storage, and secure fresh water. In response to growing threats to freshwater supplies and climate resilience, the Netherlands rolled out a nationwide Delta program. At its core, the program was driven by one bold ambition: to future-proof the Netherlands against the accelerating effect of climate change that would ensure the nation would be fully prepared by 2050. However, some of the proposals for lake management proved controversial, particularly because a freshwater lake called Volkerakzoom was choking under heavy algae growth due to excess nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen. This turned the water toxic and unsafe for swimming and recreation because the lake was already degraded and difficult to restore. If managed correctly, converting it into a saltwater lake could stop the harmful algae blooms entirely. That would not only improve the water quality but also connect it more effectively with surrounding tidal systems. But turning a freshwater lake into a saltwater lake would harm freshwater plants and animals. Also, agriculture that depends on freshwater would be heavily affected. The second proposal was to raise the water level in the IJsselmeer lake to improve freshwater storage. However, this would increase flood risk and require changes to infrastructure. Think of the IJsselmeer as the Netherlands' great water reservoir. Fed by the IJssel, it supplies drinking water to 1 million people and shields 3.5 million more from flooding. As sea levels rose faster than expected, it became increasingly difficult to discharge IJsselmeer water into the Wadden Sea. In extremely wet conditions, more river water surges into the IJsselmeer simultaneously. During the high water period of 2023 to 24, the IJsselmeer and Markmeer rose to levels never seen before. Even the larger lakes began to feel the pressure. The wind, rather than offering relief, closed off the very routes the water needed to escape. During droughts, less water flows into the IJssel River, so it moves more slowly. As a result, less water reaches the IJsselmeer and flows out to the sea. Rijkswaterstaat water stud holds the water back to protect freshwater stocks. If too little fresh water flows outward, salt water from the sea begins to infiltrate. This is called salinization. Fresh water becomes salty, which threatens crops, ecosystem, and drinking water supplies. With climate change and rising demand adding to the pressure, the IJsselmeer demands more careful stewardship than ever before. The Delta program spans 8 distinct regions, from the IJsselmeer to the Wadden coast, from the Rhine and Meuse rivers to the southeast delta, each one a frontier where flood risk management, freshwater security, and spatial adaptation converge to shape the future of the land. Rain plays its part, of course, but it's the Meuse and the Rhine that truly keep this land alive with freshwater. But where this freshwater actually comes from is something that tells a deeper story. One that begins the moment water crosses into the country at 2 key points, Loviet and Aitchen. From there, it fans out. Some head southwest through the river towards the delta. Some travels north through the IJsselmeer all the way to Groningen. And eventually, it all finds its way out to the sea. In the Netherlands, climate has shifted before, but today it is mostly caused by human activities. For over 2 decades, the Dutch government identified and analyzed the key issues, but the most urgent ones such as droughts, water management, flood risk, and drainage in urban and rural areas were tackled first. Since the early 2010s, Dutch engineers have embraced a new urban design philosophy called Sponge City. This idea first took root in China, but the Netherlands has been practicing it ever since after Dutch engineers recognized how the approach could slash urban flood risk by almost 50% when properly implemented. Instead of expelling water from the city as quick as possible, storing and utilizing it became a new design philosophy. These cities absorb, store, and slowly release water just like a sponge. There is no single price tag for the Netherlands Sponge City approach. Instead of one massive project, it's built through hundreds of smaller interventions, costing cities like the Rotterdam over 350 million euros and likely billions nationwide over time. But even a trillion-dollar economy like the Netherlands has constantly reinforced its flood defenses as conditions changed over time. Despite spending billions of euros on flood control, there is also growing uncertainty about the current systems. Can the system handle extreme future sea level rises, or will the Dutch have to continuously fight for survival? No one knows for certain, but if history has taught us anything, it is this: the Netherlands has never waited for the water to win. And today, it is not just surviving, it is showing the rest of the world how to live with water permanently and without fear.